But I'm delighted to welcome our guest speaker, James Close. And James is from the University of Plymouth, where his research interests are really around the psychological heuristics and biases that we have as humans that are exploited by gaming, gambling, and social media companies. And James has also been looking at the kind of subsequent impacts of that on us as individuals and society. So James's talk, as we see there, is on loot boxes, gambling, video games, and predatory monetization. So over to you, James. I think James is going to speak for about 45 minutes. Questions in the room we can take. And if people online, if you have any questions, if you can just put them in the Q&A box, that would be brilliant, and we'll take as many as we can. But over to you, James.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you for inviting me up. It's been a little while coming, but it's always lovely to be up here at Bristol. Yeah, it feels as for us down there, further down the peninsula, it feels like a very dynamic cultural city. So it's lovely to have the opportunity to come up here and talk to you all. So yeah, this is a large piece of work that we conducted over the last 2 or 3 years, which was funded by Gamble Aware, and it's a large collaboration, primarily led from the University of Plymouth and the University of Wolves as well, with myself and Helen and Stuart doing a large amount of this work in Plymouth, and then Joe Lloyd and Laura Nicklin doing a lot of the work in Wolverhampton as well, and some other collaborators elsewhere as well. So yeah, we define a loot box. For those of you who don't know, I know there's often a very mixed sort of cohort of these talks, and some people know really well what a loot box is and other people are completely naive. So we define a loot box as any game-related purchase with a chance-based outcome, which sounds like a simple definition, but it's quite a well thought out one, and it encapsulates a lot of things that sometimes aren't classified as a loot box. So there's obvious things like the FIFA or EA Sports FC, as it's now called. This slide is actually showing its age already because the game name has changed, and you wouldn't be opening Messi in your pack anymore. It would be, you'd be looking for your Haaland or whatever. But essentially, you buy these player packs a bit like, those old sticker packs, and you're hoping to unbox, someone like Messi or Ronaldo or whatever. Not only is that cool, give you bragging rights with your mates, they actually help you play better in the game, so you can beat your mates when you're playing them at home or online. Other examples are things like in Counter-Strike, they've got this so-called crate and key mechanics. They give you this crate, and then you have to pay to unlock it. I think the keys are 169 these days. You unlock it and you're hoping to get a really cool looking gun, such as these ones here. Note here that these guns is purely cosmetic, so they don't actually make you any better in Counter-Strike. They just look cool. And there's something here going on with like teenage boys gambling for guns. I mean, they're onto a big winner with this strategy. But then, I think the psychology of that is maybe something for another day. But another thing that definition leads on to is things like Pokemon Go, for example, where you have this like egg hatcheries. So you can go around, you can collect your eggs, and then you have to hatch them out, hoping to get your favorite Pokemon character, but you can pay to get more hatcheries, which increases your chance of getting that Pokemon character you like. So this definition of a loot box does include quite a lot of chance-based reward mechanisms. So yeah, just this slide to show they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. So yeah, very obviously they have very similar structural similarities to gambling. And because of this, they come under a lot of scrutiny from legal, academic, and media scrutiny. And really, they got a lot of attention after this paper. A lot of attention 2018, 2019, when this paper was published by David Zender at the University of York, who basically showed in a survey there's a big correlation between people who engage with loot boxes, people who are buying them, and their rating on the problem gambling severity index. So basically, the higher their problem gambling symptoms, the more likely they were to spend on loot boxes. However, these aren't gambling, and the reason they're gambling is because the prize is a digital gaming asset, not money. And this is what stops them being legally classified as gambling in most jurisdictions. So gambling, technically, you've got to wage some money, you've got to stake some money, there's a bit of chance, and then you have to win a prize, and that prize has to be money. In the UK, I mean, the technical parlance is money's worth winnings, which obviously these don't always have. It's also worth noting the UK have recently, in July last year, I think it was, published their response to a call for evidence on loot boxes, and they've gone down a industry self-regulation route, and I'm going to come back to that at the end and discuss what's going on there. But I think this this backlash against loot boxes, of which there's been quite a lot of media scrutiny and so forth, is part of a wider techlash that's going on, and we know that games developers are, and gambling companies and so forth are using certain known psychological techniques to have that user engagement, user retention, to keep people using them, and it's something that government and others have become very interested in. This idea of addictive design and technology, but I'd argue this goes back a long way, actually, and I think the gambling companies were really what led the way here in terms of what we're seeing now with big social media and technology companies. And it perhaps all started with this, or even before, with the advent of slot machines in the 1890s. But this was in 1957. Forster and Skinner published their schedules of reinforcement, where essentially they had their model organisms, whether they be pigeons or rats, generally mostly pigeons. They put them in these boxes and they'd give them a reward. This is mostly mostly a food-based reward, but you can do it with drugs or whatever. And you can either give it, every time they push a button, they get a reward, they get that food or drug or whatever. And if they could do on various schedules, so it could be, every time they push a button, they get it every time, or maybe every 5 presses or every 3 hours. But what they found is that when they're given variably, like on a completely random schedule, like gambling, the animals just press it all the time. It's got this really addictive quality, and that is across organisms, across different rewards and so forth. And the gambling companies were taking note. We know they were taking note because these are the executives of the companies at the time said they were. They said they were reading Forster and Skinner. They knew about it. And it's worth noting that Forster and Skinner, this was pretty big data for its day. So that someone has counted up the data points in this publication. I think they had about 3 million data points. But then when you go on to the 70s and what these companies were doing in Las Vegas, IGT and Bally, who were reading this, they had basically the same setup. They had the means and ends of experimentation in one place, and they called these like the rat people. I don't think that was meant in a nasty way. It was meant in a way that we've got an experimentation tool, in one place, and their key metric was time on device. They were just, how can we have that user attention? How can we optimize for it? Which really predates what we see with social media. So they were really, optimizing for various aspects that we see now in the modern gambling sphere. Those lights, the color, the sound, the music, the timing of it, things like near misses, are more likely to keep that user attention, losses disguised as wins when you're winning less than your actual stake, and really giving that person that illusion of control and that very kind of something about in the zone experience, the kind of, you can lose yourself in it very easily. But that's the mechanics we've seen imported largely wholesale into various aspects of modern video game monetization. You see again all these techniques, and arguably, we see these on our mobile phones or in our pockets. They have that user attention that imports a lot of these mechanics as well. So yeah, back to loot boxes, as sort of a bit of wider context. I think people like GamblerWare are particularly interested in them because it's not just that gambling-like mechanics. Obviously, they're very available to children as well. We know that, and we know a lot of children are playing video games, buying loot boxes. So we were commissioned by GamblerWare to do this large package of research. So really it involved these various stages, and I'll just sort of skip through them very quickly and give them a surface level discussion in here. But essentially we started off doing a literature review, what was out there already. We did qualitative interviews with a series of gamers who were buying loot boxes. Off the back of that, we developed our own sort of systematic quantitative scale for measuring the reasons people were buying these, which was then deployed in a survey, which at first stage was like a very large scale, very short survey. And then we drilled down into a cohort of those people with a much more in-depth survey. So in terms of like the literature review, it's a systematic literature review. You've got the Prisma flowchart. I won't talk to all these details, but it's a very structured academic approach to doing this sort of work, which span out this outcome. I've left the stats up there for those of you who are statistically versed, but essentially what we found is that original publication with David Zendel showing this link between problem gambling and loot box engagement. There was over a dozen studies repeating this. So it's very repeated, very robust finding. Probably got 24 studies now since we published that. So 12 out of 13 studies have repeated that, and the so-called effect size is what we'd call a moderate effect size, but in the social sciences, this is pretty chunky and quite a rare size. This is a reasonably sized association. There's also a link in a series of papers as well, showing a link between loot boxes and what's called problem video gaming scale. I mean, I have issues with that as a construct, and I think it's potentially like other scales, potentially stigmatizing of normal behavior. But we're using it because everyone else is. But that's now been published. So you can see the details of work in that. But I bring this slide up with a Venn diagram to flag that actually these are very overlapping constructs we're talking about. Problem video gaming, loot box engaging, problem gambling. They're very sort of overlapping in terms of potentially impulsive, compulsive, addictive behaviours, and it's not a surprise we find overlaps between them, because psychologically there's a lot of overlap in these constructs. That is a point I'll come back to later. So a fun sort of adjunct to the literature review we did was when we did the systematic review, we realised that a lot of these publications, so 6 of these publications we reviewed, made their data open access, where anyone could access it and download it, particularly the work of David Zendel, so very thankful to him for doing that. But we downloaded that data and wanted to do something interesting with it, where we were kind of influenced by this talk by a CEO of a small mobile games developer, which became very notorious on the internet. And I think that games people might have seen this because it's become very infamous. But basically, he was kind of like talking about how you go whaling, how you capture these big players who spend vast amounts of money on your mobile game in a fairly kind of classless talk. But we were kind of interested in using these data sets to ask the question, were these players, these big whales, these high-spending players, were they wealthy gamers, as the gaming industry would like you to believe, or were they more likely to be problem gamblers or at-risk individuals? We're also interested in how much profit the industry were making from these. Essentially, what we found in this piece of secondary analysis is that these high spenders were a substantial portion of industry profits. So about the top 5% of spenders on loot boxes, around 50% of these game companies' income in that data set. And that's billions of pounds we're talking. These people as well, this 5% of people, are much more likely to be problem gamblers than the wider population. Around a third of them were classified as problem gamblers. A similar amount problem video gamers likely as well. But there was no link with self-report earnings. So no link with earnings at all. So conclusion being that games developers, unwittingly or not, and I think a lot of them are vaguely aware of what's going on here, are disproportionately profiting from moderate and high-risk individuals rather than high-earning customers. And this really tallies with those anecdotes or media reports you see, and I put this picture here not because I like it, but because I think actually, again, it's kind of like stigmatizing video gaming, that there are all these people playing in this darkened room. But this is, the sort of picture you see on the BBC website and other news websites, often with the headline of, my son spent £10,000 on loot boxes or whatever. But these people do actually exist. We've come across them in our research. There are, to give a pen portrait, I guess, people talk to would be, a young lad plays Counter-Strike, manages to open a really precious gun, it's worth a lot of money. And for a while, you could take those guns and you could actually gamble with them on secondary marketplaces to try and win more guns or money, starts gambling with it, makes some money, starts doing very well, starts then losing his own money and his parents' money on these things, and it all collapses like that. Another pen portrait would be young man arrives at university, gets that disposable income for the first time, got his student loan, starts playing FIFA with his mates in September when it comes out, when he's got all that cash, and starts just kind of buying a lot of these loot boxes, spends a lot of his, or most of his, most of his money already in September, and potentially ends up dropping out of university on the back of this. So it's not perhaps the harms we see to such a level you do with gambling sometimes, but it has some parallels there in terms of the harms you do hear about anecdotally and you can come across. So yeah, next thing we did was these qualitative interviews with gamers. And that was a really mixed cohort. Most of them were perfectly healthful gamers, I would say, and all of them were loot box buyers. But we were interested in talking to people about it because there's no qualitative academic evidence here at the time at all. And we know that this is complex. It's people are buying these for a multitude of complex reasons. And things like problematic gambling, it's associated with factors, impulsion, compulsion, escape motivations, and really a deeper understanding of why people are buying these things would help us understand the difference between harmful and healthful, and potentially enable strategies like risk assessment and so forth. So we did a purposive sampling from across the UK, different demographics and so forth. Did a thematic analysis. On the data, essentially, we could see 6 clear themes was the way we grouped them. There was the opening experience, the whole excitement of it. There's the value of the content, which could be financial, but could be like aesthetic or functional, game-related factors, they're paying to win and so forth. A lot of social influences, a lot of self-esteem and image building and so forth, bragging rights and all that. There was those very gambling-like emotive and impulsive reasons as well. And then fear of missing out was a big overlapping factor as well here in terms of like limited time offers and so forth. And I've got a slide for each of these different factors, which I won't talk about each one, but they're here if we want to come back and discuss them. But like the opening experience, you've got people saying, like on slots, you play a spin, a certain animation happens, something goes off in your head. It's just like that. You've got the value of content, which was often very financial, but it had other types of value as well in there. Game-related motives in terms of getting that advantage in the game. Social motivations were a really big thing. Your friends were doing it. You wanted to have that image in the game and so forth. And those emotive, impulsive motivations as well. Those urges and everything, and the fear of missing out too. And these were contextualized in terms of like wider triggers and facilitators as well. The FOMO and all the nudges and the ease of purchase and game-related currency is another thing that I won't really talk about today, but it's a big factor. The fact that you have to buy 10,000 gold coins at $6.99. You do the currency conversion rate there because I can't. Or it'd be $7.99. You get 20,000 gold coins for $7.99 if you want. So people weren't really aware of what they were spending on these things before they even bought them as well. So there's a whole context of all these different cost obfuscation tools as well. So yeah, the conclusions of that are that I think it really challenged traditional money's worth definitions of value. There was a lot of other types of value in there for people. There's social then there's the social factors, the gambling-like factors, and that context of funneling and nudges and obfuscation. So off the back of that qualitative work, the next thing we did was try and encapsulate this in a scale that we could deploy in a large-scale quantitative piece of work. And we've got a very robust pipeline here for scale development. I won't talk through, but essentially, you finalize all the wording of it with gamers and make sure it's understandable and clear. We did an exploratory factor analysis with a separate cohort of people, tried to break into factors, which I'll show you in a minute, validated those with a completely separate group of people as well. But essentially, this showed us that we had basically items in technical parlance, that tapped all those domains I've just talked about, and using our factor analysis, statistical technique, they really mapped quite closely to what we'd already come from logical principles using that qualitative work. Statistically, it mapped very nicely to that as well. So then we've got a nice scale that we can deploy in a large scale survey. And that's all been published as well, both the qual work and the scale development. And then we deployed this in a survey. Another survey, and you might groan here because there's already been a dozen surveys done or 2 dozen surveys done. Why do we need another survey? Well, the short answer is because we said we would do it to gamble aware. So we were sort of tied to do it. But our review, the fact we've done a systematic review, and then, okay, where are the gaps? What do we need to know? So that allowed us to design a superior survey. So we had a comprehensive battery of questions and psychological instruments, which I'll come into shortly. It was much bigger scale and size to what had been done before. Allowed us to get some of the nuances we were really interested in, things like impulsivity and these sort of game-related experiences of flow, that kind of in-the-zone feeling they can give you. And in addition to like purely looking at loot box purchases, we were also interested in like those people who don't purchase loot boxes. So we call them loot boxes and non-loot boxes. So they're gamers, they're buying stuff, but they don't engage with loot boxes. And also allowed us to use a modern, robust approach. So all of this is pre-registered on what's called Open Science Foundation. So we said what we're going to do, all the hypotheses we're going to make before we did it, all the approaches we're going to use. And like others, we've made all our data open access, so it's all out there on the internet if you want to download it and play with it yourself. So yeah, there's all the pre-registration. So I'll come back to the things we're measuring in a bit. But essentially, we use like this two-stage survey approach that I mentioned. So it's a tiered survey. So and this is on prolific academic. So we did a large short-scale survey, like just really a 1-2 minute survey, just a couple of questions. You know, do you video game? Are you buying loot boxes? Essentially, that's pretty much it. A couple of gambling questions as well. And that allowed us to survey like a large number of people, 16,000 people. And then from those, we drilled down into, with much more depth, into about 1,500 people who are buying loot boxes and about 1,500 people who weren't buying loot boxes, with a much longer sort of half-an-hour survey. So with the large-scale survey, I mean, there was interesting findings there. So the people who were engaging with loot boxes were much like, they were younger men, not surprisingly, I think. Also really, really striking how much more gambling was going on amongst this cohort. So about 50% more gambling in those people buying loot boxes, 40%, 46% of them gamble versus 28% for non-loot boxes. These are all people over 18, it must be said. But also interestingly, what we found is association with lower educational attainment and lower level of employment amongst these people. And it's, that's on a large sample, so, you can detect smaller effect sizes in there, but it's certainly there. That's been published as well in Addiction as a short report. So then we drilled down into an in-depth survey with these, this loot box cohort and non-loot box cohort, all pre-registered on the Open Science Foundation, but we were interested in like load of just through everything in the kitchen sink into this, demographic variables, gaming and gambling related variables, how much time they're gaming, how much they're gambling, and then a bunch of instruments as well, like the Problem Gambling Severity Index, Internet Gaming Disorder, short form for Internet Gaming Disorder. Again, you could argue about this as a construct. We threw other things in there as well. So there's what's called the Risky Loot Box Index, RLI, which you could think of as a bit like the PGSI for loot box engagement. People are saying they're doing this more than they wanted to and spending more than they intended to on these things. And we'd also looked at like well-being and psychological distress. So what we found, and this is just a simple sort of first level analysis and looking at bivariate correlations, so correlations between one of these variables and another with our primary outcome variable, which we specified as this thing here, the risky loot box engagement, people spending more on these things than they intended. And these are like the correlations with these different measures of various psychological variables. Not surprisingly, we found exactly what other studies have found before us. So that link with problem gambling and problem video gaming was there, with that moderate sized effect size and a highly significant p-value in our data set as well. But we also found some other novel things in there. So we also measured gambling cognitions using sort of gambling cognitions scale, which is essentially like those erroneous beliefs people might have about gambling, like, if you have a series of losses, you're due a win, for example, or that you can have some control over the outcome, those kind of erroneous beliefs that people have. So, which we know is linked with problem gambling, but also here we can show a link between those gambling cognitions, those erroneous gambling cognitions, and loot box engagement as well. We've got a link with impulsivity as well in there, a measure of impulsivity, game-related experiences of flow as well, and this is a very pragmatic approach to it, and the video gamers probably know about this better than the psychologists, I think, actually, but that was measured using a very short game experience questionnaire, a few items about, did you feel in the zone while playing the game? So certainly there's a link there as well. No link with income again, so people earning more weren't spending more on them. And then we've got our new scale motivations for loot box engagement. Not surprisingly, it's pretty darn obvious that the more people are motivated to spend on loot boxes, the more they spend on them. This might seem like the most strikingly obvious finding ever. What is interesting here, though, is that, and we pre-registered this actually, is that this distraction compulsion subscale would be the most strongly linked with risky engagement, with that, people spending more than they wanted to. So specifically, too much spending and risky spending seem to be linked with those sort of compulsive and escape motivations, and captured by that subscale, which we did pre-register. And also interesting, a link with psychological distress as well here. So those spending more on loot boxes had higher scores on what's called the Kessler distress scale. Without showing you the data, we had this non-loot box cohort as well, and we had similar findings there. But what's different is that there was no marginal or no correlation with problem gambling, which really reiterates the gambling-like characteristics of loot boxes, and smaller links with other things in there, with internet gaming disorder, with flow, with gambling cognitions, and the sort of general conclusion there is that loot boxes with this variable ratio reinforcement, this very powerful psychological mechanism, are an extreme example against that backdrop of other monetization techniques. And I think other monetization techniques are potentially liable to exploit disadvantaged or at-risk individuals, problem gamers, problem gamblers, perhaps at a lower rate than loot boxes themselves. So this work's just coming out very soon. It's in press at the moment. I think it's coming out 16th of December in Royal Society Open Science. So there's 2 linked papers here, in fact. So I've just been talking to you about the results from that first one, the relation between psychological variables and loot box engagement, the pre-registered hypotheses. So you can see that paper there if you want more depth. But we also did a second paper here, which was about exploratory analyses. The reasoning being here is that, as I mentioned earlier, with that Venn diagram, we've got a bunch of very overlapping constructs here, and they're all sort of tapping into overlapping things. And a lot of those bivariate associations I showed you between those things, it could actually be, the shared variance between them that's kind of causing that. So we conducted a Bayesian multiple regression. You don't need to know the technical details too much here. But really it was basically bunging everything into one single model to see what was most predictive of those things once we take them all together of loot box engagement, once you take all that shared variance into account. And actually the models here, because you can fit all these things endlessly and you can change the models, you can get different outcomes, and we know that's a problem in part of the replicability crisis in like psychology and medicine, 20, 30 years ago. It still happens now. So we pre-registered the models. We said, this is how we're going to do it. But we didn't actually make any hypotheses about what would come out of this model, but we did do exactly what we said we would. And the results are ridiculously complex and nuanced. We could spend another 2 hours talking about this if you want, or we could spend another 2 weeks if you want, or we could stay here for another 2 months if you like, which is essentially what we did with these findings. We spent about 2 months just talking about them endlessly and what it all means. But we haven't got that time today. So I'll give you like the papers coming out so you can read it yourselves. But some salient findings, I think the most interesting points, the most interesting take-home messages here is that pretty much all the previous surveys, including like the one I've just shown you of ours, were those simple bivariate correlations. There's been very little research putting them in multiple regression models. But in our multiple regression, or most of the models, that well-established link with problem gambling actually kind of fades away and starts disappearing, interestingly. Instead, it appears to be underpinned by that shared variance between problem gambling and problem video gaming and gambling-related cognitions as well. So it's kind of that, those illusions of control, the fact you do a win, those erroneous beliefs that are driving that concomitant behavior in both gambling and loot box engagement, along with that, that problem video gaming, that over-engagement potentially in video gaming as well. Similarly, associations between impulsivity and loot box engagement weren't so much observed in our multiple regressions. And it seems that potentially these are largely mediated via problem video gaming. And there's equivocal results here in the literature about impulsivity and loot box engagement. Some people finding it, some people not, and that potentially kind of helps explain that a bit. Another kind of odd thing we saw in our multiple regressions was that there was a link with both higher well-being. That's using something called the Warwick-Edinburgh well-used scale for this. So higher well-being, but also higher psychological distress using a psychological distress scale and loot box engagement. What's going on there is an open question, I guess, but it does echo earlier findings here. So someone else has found like both higher and lower mood with loot box engagement. So we're not the only ones seeing this slightly counterintuitive finding. And I think it's, we've got an open access data set. It's one of those open questions we have there, and potentially we can do some subgroup analysis there, whether there is genuinely people who are, wealthier individuals who want to spend on loot box, get that personal, gain and identity gain from engaging with them and a higher well-being from it, and whether there's people actually going under distress and are more at-risk individuals who are also buying them. So I would hypothesize there's going to be two subgroups here, but that's an open question still. So yeah, bringing that to conclusion in a way, the survey work really showed that there was a bunch of demographic and psychological factors driving loot box engagement, age, sex, education, entertainment, unemployment, also that direct link it seems with problem video gaming, gambling cognitions, also game-related experiences of flow as well were driving increasing expenditure on loot boxes, and then maybe the link with problem gambling a bit more indirect. However, this is all cross-sectional evidence. You can't differentiate what's cause and effect here, what's driving which behavior. And this is interesting. I mean, so people have talked about like so-called gateway effects, and we always put it in inverted commas because I really don't like that phrase. I think it's got negative connotations of, you smoke a joint, you're going to be hooked on heroin or whatever, and I think it's a really problematic phrase. But some researchers have suggested that loot boxes could be this gateway into later gambling problems. And this is an important question because the UK government have specifically cited this lack of causational evidence as a reason why they haven't legislated. So, it's an important question. But actually, it's not that simple. It's, there's possibilities here. There could be the classic gateway effects that loot boxes are driven into later gambling. Could just be that gamblers happen to purchase more loot boxes, that they're overlapping behaviours. And actually, I think more likely there's complex dynamic relationship between all these things, and we know that gambling interacts with other risky behaviors in complex bidirectional ways, and loot boxes are very similar, I would argue, which is classified as like common liability theories, which I think is a much better way of understanding and framing these effects. So we were interested in this question, and we did as a sort of another adjunct to our own survey. We asked questions for around 1,000 of the gamers who were both gamblers and loot boxers about these kind of gateway effects. So we asked them, whether they were, if they were gamblers and loot box buyers, whether they thought there was a direct causational role in gateway effects, i.e. they bought loot boxes first and then they later started gambling. And around 20% of them thought there was like a direct causational role in their original loot box behavior leading to gateway effects into later gambling behaviors. And then almost identical number of people, 20% again, had it the other way around, where they had been gamblers first and their previous experience with gamblers led them to want to buy loot boxes. That work's been published as well in Addictive Behaviours. I think the really interesting thing here was that those cohorts of people who talked about gateway or reverse gateway effects, they were more likely to be problem gamblers, problem video gamers, have those higher gambling related cognitions. They spent more on loot boxes, they gambled more as well, spent more on gambling, and they're more likely to be under 18 when they started doing those things. So a whole nexus of potentially risk individuals in that gateway cohorts. We also did a little bit of content analysis, a little bit of summative content analysis where they had like free text responses about what they thought were causing these gateway effects, and essentially, the participants talked about that, the sensation seeking, that normalization of gambling-like behaviours, and the addictive nature of both activities. Again, it's cross-sectional. It's like retrospective, asking people what they thought. It's not longitudinal follow-up studies, but those are starting to come out now. So the government saying the evidence isn't out there. There's one cited here, but there's another publication as well where loot box buyers were followed up over time, and those people who engaged with loot boxes were more likely to gamble later on and have problem gambling symptoms as well. So yeah, ultimately coming on to like the impacts of this work. So we've published this with Gamble Aware. We also, reported our evidence to DCMS on their call for evidence on loot boxes. And essentially, I think we've got enough evidence to show that key stakeholders here have a duty of care for various individuals, and these are very, very large key stakeholders we're talking about here. And they should be doing things like, odds disclosures, age limits, limit setting options, clear and understandable information, safe default settings, and so forth. And that's kind of what the government, a lot of other people saying the same things to the message to the government, and they've decided to take this instead of regulating, which obviously does have issues and it is difficult to do in certain ways. They've gone down an industry-led route for this. Having said that, in our original work, we did say, we've got concerns about this being industry-led. We know what industry are like in other spheres, and we know they're like this in gaming as well. The government have already said themselves they struggle to get clear answers and useful information from gaming industry in particular. And not surprisingly, since this industry-led approach came out around 16 months ago, there's been very, very little action from industry. There has been action, but some online, this is published academic evidence coming out now about what's happened in gaming companies. Some online storefronts have compliance rates with what the gaming companies were meant to be doing, as low as 7%. But actually, we know that a lot of these measures don't actually work anyway. They have really doubtful utility. Whether things like odds disclosures, kids don't understand them. Adults ignore age. The age limits on the boxes. I'm a father of a teenage son who researches in this area, and I largely ignore the boxes. So if I'm ignoring it, what hope is there for everyone else? And yeah, the government as well cited this lack of evidence for that causational role. But I think there's there is a much stronger evidence of certainly of financial harm going on, potentially of psychological harm, and those common liability with other harmful behaviours as well. And it's worth pointing out that the DCMS did say, unless tangible results begins to be seen in the near future, we will not hesitate to consider legislative options to protect children, young people, and adults. And I'd say it's been a kind of woefully underdone so far. So whether the DCMS need to, actually pull their finger out and do something about it, they've got to start at least threatening. Come on, we need compliance rates at 100% here across the board. And this happened with FOB-Ts as well. The government didn't do anything for a long time, and ultimately they did need to step in. I'll finish with a really stark example here, and this is arguably a slightly axe grindy couple of slides, but I think this needs to be made to people who aren't gamers. This point needs to be made to people who aren't gamers, who aren't aware of this sphere. So one example is Steam, Valve. So these are the biggest online seller of PC games. It's a huge market share they have, right? 75% of PC games, and you can go on there, you buy one of these crates in Counter-Strike. You can win your gun. You can take it to a marketplace which is run by Steam themselves. It's an unregulated financial marketplace. You've got, you bid and offer just like you would on the LSE. And in fact, the volume of trade where you've got time series can be quite high for some of these items, bigger than those low down stocks on stock exchanges. So, it's a large unregulated financial marketplace. Billions in trade volume. They take 5% cut from every trade on here. There's frequent allegations of fraud on here. We know that it's being used for money laundering because Steam have said as much themselves. It's a large unregulated market. You can take your your loot box item you've won, which apparently has no value, but then you can monetize it, and then you can, within that marketplace that they run, you can spend it on 34,000 different games, 20,000 different other items. And that is money's worth, very much money's worth in anyone who's logical's definition. But not only, it's not locked into that marketplace, you can encash it very easily into your PayPal account using the Steam API. So they run the application programming interface, which you can log in to other third-party sites, which Steam don't run, but you can log in with their account, which they basically have ownership over the API, and then encash it into real money into your account. Why is that not gambling? According to 25 long page Steam subscriber agreement, which no one reads, Steam wallet funds have no cash value and are not exchangeable for cash, despite the fact they're completely facilitating you getting them as cash. So I mean, this is an independent opinion from a lawyer. They do these things do constitute gambling in all jurisdictions. Those Counter-Strike guns. Gambling Commission and position statement going back 4 or 5 years have said, a license is required for these sort of things. They've said so themselves. Why has nothing been done? I mean, I think this is a really interesting question. I think the short answer is these are some of the best resource companies in the world. They've got the best lawyers in the world. I think the Gambling Commission don't want to take them on because it will open up a can of worms that they aren't resourced to do. It extend their remit into a world they can't tackle, they can't move into. But I think it does need those position statements put there very firmly by the government and the Gambling Commission that actually, if you have APIs which let people monetize these items, you need to lock those APIs so you can't. I mean, that's just a very simple programming problem. We know it can be done, but that means, if you've got APIs which let people cash out money, then you need a license. You need a gambling license because you are gambling. I think that needs to be made very firmly. Again, we're at that stage where these points need to be made by government and so forth. So yeah, finishing off, I think it's, this is about loot boxes, but there's a bigger issue here about, how digital media should be monetized in the attention economy, where loot boxes are just one of many different types of cost obfuscation, such as like in-game currency and so forth, which are liable to overexploit those most disadvantaged and lead to digital harms. And we know there's perfectly legitimate ways of and transparent ways of monetizing online media, which have made companies a lot of money. You can have subscription models, they do work. We know they work, but I think we need to get this under wraps because this is just the start. We're moving into AR and VR world. The ways we can manipulate people are just opening up. So I think we need to make sure, like consumer rights, as we see them in bricks and mortar world, you would not be allowed to get away with kids gambling, with obfuscating currency, within game, with different currencies in a bricks and mortar store. You wouldn't allow this in a toy shop. So we should have very clear guidance of that does apply to digital worlds as well. So I'll leave it there. Time for questions, but a lot of publications on that final slide have come out. I'll leave it there and just say, actually we're not. The thing I like to finish on is we're not anti-gamers. We are gamers ourselves. My son, regularly beats me at Fortnite and FIFA, but I can still beat him at Pac-Man. So there's hope for all of us. So I will finish with that. Thank you.
I mean, 5 minutes then, there's a lot to think about, especially for somebody like me who doesn't know anything about gaming very much. So I don't know if we've got people online. If you have any questions for James, please do put them in the Q&A or in the chat box. Did anybody in the room have any questions for James?
Firstly, thank you so much. That would be really interesting and insightful. I noticed in the large-scale survey, one of the variables you're measuring is getting most spent on. And as someone who plays a lot of FIFA and eFootball, I was curious to know, when you did your analysis, did you find any kind of major effects or significant kind of differences between categories of games most spent on? So, for example, some people play FIFA more likely to engage in risky loot box behaviour than someone who played Counter-Strike or fortnight, and I'm well out of my comfort zone now. So
Yeah.
Yeah, I was interested.
Yeah.
The difference between these.
Yeah, that's a good question. There is so much data in this data set actually, and that's one of the reasons we put it online. So it is online now. I did actually get a student project to look at this. So they just looked game by game across there, and certainly there were certain games that jumped out. I'd need to dig the data out again rather than going off the top of my head and potentially misciting. But there were things like, I think, Genshin Impact and FIFA and so forth there were certain games that were, and I could have been wrong when I'm quoting that, but there were certain games which were more high spending than others. But we didn't analyze it by game type. I think that's a really interesting question, and you can slice and dice it all sorts of ways. And so we did tap a lot of variables which maybe haven't been analysed to the same extent just because of time constraints.
Yeah, sure.
But I think those are things we would like to see done with our data, for sure. Yeah, and we may do ourselves. We've got a lot of open questions ourselves, but it's what you've got time to actually do and all that.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, James. Great to see that evidence base being created. Like, you get the claim there isn't actually case now more and more dramatic in that build. Happen there. I'm just following on from that. I was really interested in the positive statement there, particularly the one where they said they just want to roll to see what happens. And that to me sort of spoke of two things that are quite interesting here about this is games rather than gambling. One is a gambling metaphor being used there, but two, that the word that seems to be used and understood in the gaming sense, where you're just playing a boss and fighting a boss and roll to see if you kill them, would you get a certain item? And that's not loot boxes, that's not gambling, you're not paying to do that, you're potentially just doing it part of the game, or maybe you're grinding to get something. But that's separate, but it's being used in the context of loot boxes there. So I'm really interested in how gamers are understanding this. Are they thinking of it as gambling? Is there a way of understanding this kind of from a video game kind of thing? Getting it, because players are obviously thinking about this in the context of gaming, but then they're using gambling methods. So yes, I don't know if that area question. Basically, because this is a video game medium, is that shaping how people are talking about it and thinking about it that make that quite hard to study it in the context of gambling?
Yeah, I think that those are good, fair questions, and I think gaming is interesting because there's so much chance inbuilt into the games. These are chance-based mechanisms throughout. I mean, technically, the difference being there that with the loot box, you're staking, you're starting to stake something, and we did try, and there has been some work proposed by academics that actually this could be slight confusion sometimes on when you're surveying in terms of gamers thinking that when they're doing reporting on like gambling scales that they're actually talking about loot boxes, not gambling. So you ask them the PGSI and actually they're just thinking about loot boxes, and that's why they get high PGSI scores. Data doesn't bear out that hypothesis actually, and that's in the second paper I cite there, the reasons for that. It doesn't appear to bear that out. And also we were quite clear in the way we asked the questions in our survey as well, and quite clear about, okay, this is what a loot box is, this is what gambling is, just to make it clear. But I think there is just a lot of overlap in people. You're right, qualitatively there's a lot of overlap in people's minds about what is a chance-based mechanism. I think generally the storefronts are quite clean and coherent in terms of when you're in game and when you're in the meta game, so to speak. So I think generally that distinction is fairly clear in people's minds, I would say.
Yeah, so we've actually got over 40 people online.
Great.
We've actually been coming in thick and fast. We've actually got 10 questions here, so I don't know if we'll get through them all. So some of them I think are a little bit more complex, which I'd like to answer offline. But so I'll go through them in order. So the first question is: have you spoken to the Gambling Commission? What did they say?
Had little contact with them. I think I have emailed one or two people historically. These messages have been put in front of them. So I mean, I'd be interested to have that dialogue with them for sure. Yeah. So I mean, I'm all ears, and I think they're in a really tricky position here, and I don't think it's their job to do this. I do think they can make those statements, and I think the government should be backstopping them with similar statements as well. But you know, I'd be interested to hear their take on it now and whether got updated perspective on it all.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is, are there any dedicated support services for those perhaps affected by harms related to loot boxes, like there are for gambling harms?
There are support services for problem video gaming, for those very heavy video gamers. In YGAM, they do a lot of educational material in this sphere, for example. And then there are special. I think there's one specialist problem video gaming clinic in the country. Is that right? As well. So there are services and education around for it, for sure. One of the slides I skipped over at the end, though, is I think, and I alluded to this a couple of times, we do need to be careful of not like pathologizing normal behaviors, and just because someone's video gaming or not, it doesn't, and actually this is work from like Oxford Internet Institute, for example, have shown this, that there's, people can be heavily gaming or heavily social media using and be perfectly functioning adults going about their life in a perfectly healthful, happy way. So do need to be careful about, okay, it's where, what's the definition of harm? When is someone undergoing harm? I think is a really interesting question. And what's the difference between that harmful and healthful behavior in all these spheres? I think is one of the things I'm interested in answering over coming years.
Actually, while you were answering there, one of our participants from GamCare has actually mentioned that GamCare's young people service can support young people who experience harm due to spending on loot boxes. So
cool.
Thank you for that answer as well. So lots of people saying thank you for a lovely talk. I'm fascinated. So many thanks from lots of people. I won't read out all the individual thank yous. Another question is, are there any legal requirements of gaming companies to minimise the harm that they might cause through loot box purchasing?
That's a good question. I mean, not legal requirements. So there's the industry-led, response to it. So there's no legal requirements at all. Having said that, I would say actually under existing consumer protection frameworks, they do have an obligation to their customers when there's potential harms there. And actually, a lot of things, as I was saying, in existing consumer protection frameworks, they wouldn't be able to get away with in a bricks and mortar store if they open one and started selling products in the way they do online. So I would say actually they do have a duty of care legally, and that's not being implemented or enforced properly.
And this is very simple. Do you know if there are any gaming companies who stand against this type of model in gaming and raising awareness to others?
Yeah, I mean, we've got video game people in the room here, but I think there's yes and no. I'd say there is game companies taking an active stand against them, making decisions not, very overt decisions not to. So like Fortnite's one of the big examples. So Tim Sweeney, the CEO of Fortnite, he banned loot boxes quite a few years ago. I think he was just canning ahead of his time and saw the writing on the wall, because Fortnite, I would say, was one of the ones that implements various other monetization approaches. The fear of missing out, particularly with young kids, that they're a big player of that card. So yeah, there are companies that have got rid of loot boxes. There are other, particularly the more independent gaming companies and a lot of companies who have this sort of Netflix subscription model for gaming, and it works very well. And there are companies making decent money doing those models, and have publicly said we don't want loot boxes in our game. We're going to go down transparent models. Maybe there's arguments there that they tend to appeal potentially to to more mature gamers who who've seen there and been it and done it, and maybe that other types of monetization are trying to exploit people who are perhaps naive, just getting into gaming the first time, pick up a game because they want to play football or play an online fighting game. They don't really realize they're going to be nudged and pushed down this route of buying things. And certainly in our work, and something that isn't reflected in our published work, but anecdotally you see a lot, is this epiphany moment in people where they go, oh my god, this game's just kind of led me into doing this behavior, and then they after that then they kind of like, well, actually I'm going to make sure I buy games that don't instigate these features in the future. So yeah, game companies are doing various things. Are they actively promoting against it? I haven't seen any of that.
Thank you. And a question from Sam Kerwin saying that fascinating talk. Thank you, James. He's interested in the point about the positive relationship with well-being and happiness. And do you have any further thoughts on this, or what it might be representing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I think what I said in the talk, perhaps in a rather rushed way, is as far as my thoughts have got with it, is that potentially that there's subgroups in a cohort, and there are people engaging with potentially engaging with monetization features who seem perfectly happy to do so and perfectly happy to spend that money. So there are people engaging with it potentially in a helpful way. Potentially this is just an association though, that those people, they've got a lot of financial capital, they've got high well-being, and they haven't spent on loot boxes. It's just purely an association, but they're not undergoing any harms from it. But the well-being may well just be wider things in our life, because well-being is complex. I mean, it's driven by so many things going on in someone's life. I mean, loot boxes are going to be only a very tiny part of someone's well-being. So, I mean, the correlation there is more likely to be driven by those other external factors than the loot box buying itself.
Slightly related. So a participant has asked, I expect many children purchase loot boxes using parent or carers' debit or credit cards, and parents might not know what they are spending on. How do we educate parents on the potential harms? And also a comment related from Glamcare saying that Glamcare also provide support for parents, so that they're both in the comments, but they're not connected. So yes, so the question about advice for parents where children are using their credit or debit cards.
Yeah, I mean, where do you start with that? That's another study that hasn't been done, I think, and the amount of parents' money that is both knowingly and unknowingly spent on these things must be vast. Yeah, I mean, what can you say? I mean, I think a lot of it knowingly. I think being a parent, you get hassled into doing things by your kids, and then there's the illicit going on as well. I think the answers to those are that there should be tighter enforcement from the gaming side in terms of there should be spending limits, so you can't just rack up thousands of pounds on these things, because often the thousands of pounds we rack up on these things, there is something going wrong, either with that person or they've got access to funds they shouldn't have. So there should be default spending limits which are in place. I think from a parent perspective, I think being curious and inquisitive with your kids. I mean, in a day-to-day pressures of life, it's not always easy, but I think it's just really important to spend time gaming with your kids to know what they're doing and what content they're engaging with, and having a look over their shoulder all the time, and talking to them about it is all you can do. And that's probably much better, I think, than looking at game labeling and all that sort of stuff, which isn't that helpful, I don't think.
And two sort of very big questions, so I don't think you'll probably be able to do them credit in just a couple of minutes we've got left, but they were raising. So great presentation. On the levers to lobby for, I was wondering if you thought there should be any messaging or similar to safer gambling on products, and or signposting to gambling support services, and also any evidence on the impact of advertising. Does in-game advertising influence spend? They're two separate questions, but
I guess very shortly, first one, yes. Second one, in-game advertising. I'm just trying to think of in-game adverts as I know them. Has anyone got any examples of in-game adverts? I know there's certainly advertising on social media that's put out there a lot in spheres that it shouldn't be, and I think there is going to be an impact there, for sure. But yeah.
Speaking as a gamer myself, I mean, I've only really played, but all the in-game adverts can be seasonal, can be quite time-based. So, even last week, last couple of weeks ago, there was a Black Friday. It's stale, but it is. And coins, you can play coins.
Yeah, I mean, you do see a lot of that like limited time offer stuff. And that certainly is driving engagement in these products for sure. Yeah, and that.
Perhaps it's another research project.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for FOMO's, that fear of missing out is a big thing, and there's always an offer though. That's the thing, and there's always something that you need to be spending your money on now, or you won't get it again.
I think we're probably out of time for everybody, so just want to say thanks so much, James, for a really fascinating talk, and thanks to everybody for the great questions and engagement. So